want to invite you tonight to open in your New Testament to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. I can't even begin to tell you how glad I am that that sun went down just a little bit. As Roderick was up here, I was reminded of Moses as his face, was glowing. I was going to bring a veil to him, but thankfully it went away. I actually went to the classroom back there and got one of the portable podiums and told Chris Robin, Chris, if I get up there and I give the word, bring that to me because I'm going somewhere else. I'm not going to do that. When Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, he began with several qualities that would be characteristic of citizens in the kingdom of God. We refer to these characteristics as the Beatitudes. And so in Matthew chapter 5, he would talk about those who are poor in spirit and those who mourn and those who are meek in verse 5, those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, those who are merciful, those who are pure in heart, those who are peacemakers, and those who are not just persecuted, but for righteousness' sake. That's the quality, people who are righteous. And so Jesus goes through all of those, and he says this is what it's going to look like, or a person's going to look like, who is a citizen in the kingdom. The person who's not characterized by these qualities that we describe or we call the Beatitudes really just can't be a disciple of Jesus. These are at the core, at the heart of what a kingdom citizen looks like. And when you read through these qualities, what you find is that none of them are very impressive when you measure them by the standards of this world. In fact, they're not impressive at all when viewed from that standpoint. And so what Jesus went on to do, though, is to point out just how important these qualities are and how important the people are who possess them. And so he would say to such people in verse 13 of Matthew 5, "You are the salt of the earth." And in describing his disciples in this way, what he did is he provided a very powerful illustration of the kind of impact that his disciples were meant to have in the world of which they were a part. And as disciples of Jesus, we are responsible. We're responsible for living out our faith in whatever way we are, in whatever area we may find ourselves, wherever we find ourselves. We are called upon to live distinctively. And it's not the size of our influence that is our concern. That's not the main concern. It is that we seek to be an influence wherever we are and whatever we do, whatever way we can be. And if we are truly striving to follow Jesus, then his words apply to us. You are the salt of the earth. And actually, if you're a Christian, the question isn't actually whether or not you're salt. The question is whether or not you're functioning in that capacity. And so I want to talk a little bit this evening about the significance of being salt. It's interesting to me that Jesus would use such a common substance to teach a lesson about the effect that his followers would have in this world. Salt was highly valued in the ancient world. And of course, there wouldn't have been a house in all the land that would have been without it. It wasn't just because it, gave flavor. That wasn't the only reason for it. There's no way that these people who heard Jesus could have misunderstood what he was saying to them. When we read that Jesus called his followers the salt of the earth, I'm not sure we just naturally understand the kind of value that he was placing upon them. I said earlier that it was highly valued in the ancient world, but that's almost an understatement, really. And let me take just a moment to kind of illustrate that for you. There was a time when the Roman government actually paid its soldiers with salt. Not entirely. It's not all they got, but in part. In fact, our English word salary comes from the Latin word that means salt. And that might not seem all that exciting to us, like a very good deal, but they didn't complain because it was a valuable commodity. That's how valuable it was. Salt was used by people in the Middle East in ancient times to ratify agreements and covenants. I've read that they actually still do that at times today as well. Salt was a symbol of fidelity and constancy for these people in ancient times. And you can go back to passages like Numbers chapter 18 and verse 19 and some others in the Old Testament that even refer to a covenant of salt. It is an agreement that people would enter into, and it would play a part in all of that. It was an important ingredient in many of the sacrifices that were offered by the children of Israel. The grain offering included salt. Leviticus 2 verse 13 tells us. The burnt offering included it as well. The offering of incense. We read about that in our class this morning from the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 30 and verse 35. That was part of the mixture that they used for their incense. It was valuable. And the reason why salt was this valuable in the ancient world is because of its ability to hold back decay. That was the reason it was valuable. And so it came to be used in all of these other ways because it primarily served as a preservative. And if it didn't possess these antiseptic qualities, it wouldn't have been considered valuable enough to be used for all of these other things. And so salt was primarily important in the ancient world for that reason. Again, it was a preservative. And so keep in mind that we're dealing here with a point in the history of the world where there are no refrigeration systems. And if you caught, say, some fish on the Sea of Galilee and you wanted to take them to Jerusalem and bring them to market, you couldn't just put them on ice. You don't put them in the Yeti and take them to Jerusalem. You would preserve them with salt. And so Peter and Andrew and James and John, and really everybody else for that matter, would have understood this process. Those guys were fishermen. They would have got this. But in reality, everyone would have understood the principle. It was just a part of life in the ancient world. And every house in the land would have had salt readily available for these reasons, just like every house in our country has a refrigerator. That's just how you operate. If you want to keep things from spoiling, that's what you have. And so Jesus used what was a very common substance in order to teach a very important lesson. And it was this ability to fight decay that caused Jesus to use salt as a metaphor for his disciples. You see, ever since the entrance of sin into the world, dealing with decay has just been a part of life. It's just been the common lot of all mankind, whether we're talking physically or morally. And just as salt was used to hold back decay in the physical realm, what Jesus was trying to tell his disciples is that's the function you serve in the moral or in the spiritual realm. And so have you ever thought about how significant it was for Jesus to say to these people who were listening to him, you are the salt of the earth? I think one thing that's implied in the words of Jesus is that this world has a problem with moral corruption and moral decay. I think that's implied in what Jesus said. You notice that already. You see it as you look around. All you have to do is go out there and it's on every hand. You look in the pages of the Bible and you find that it's been that way for a really long time. The world has a problem with moral corruption and decay. The Apostle Peter would talk about in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4. He would talk about the corruption that is in the world because of lust or evil desire. And when people follow their evil desires rather than following the will of God, the result of that is always corruption. And again, we can't deny that we see that in our society. People are encouraged to just do whatever they want to do, regardless of how morally corrupt a particular conduct is. It really doesn't matter. You just do what pleases you in some way. And what we need to understand is that we can't afford to be unconcerned about this for several reasons, not the least of which is the consequences for these people who are being corrupted. The Apostle Paul talked about the fact in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 18 that there are people who are perishing. And the word he used there in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 18 is a word that many times is translated lost. People are being lost. They are perishing as a result of the corruption that is in the world. And the truth is, we ought to be concerned about that. But something else that is implied in the words of Jesus is that this world is in desperate need of what we as disciples have to offer. Isn't that what Jesus was getting at when he said, you're the salt of the earth? How often have you thought about the fact that you, just because you are a follower of Jesus, serve to hold back the corruption and the decay that's part of this world? When was the last time you thought about the significance of your life in those terms? How serious do we take that responsibility? If we demonstrate the qualities that Jesus discussed in the Beatitudes, the qualities we're supposed to have as Christians, I'll tell you something. We're not going to be liked by everybody. We're going to be hated by some people. There's no doubt about that. But I believe the verse we're looking at this evening indicates that we'll also have an impact on some people. And we don't know which of those responses we're going to get, and that's at least one of the reasons why we need to always do what's right, to do the right thing, to be the people we're called upon to be. You don't know, you never know whose life you might affect by the way you choose to live. Tell you what, that's important. So let's talk a little bit about the seriousness of being salt. Jesus warned about the need to take our identity as disciples seriously. And so he didn't just say, you are the salt of the earth. He said, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. That's a warning to us. It's a warning not to let our influence diminish. If you know anything about the compound sodium chloride, you recognize that technically it's not possible for salt to lose its taste. It's not how that works. Salt is salt. And so to understand what Jesus is saying here, we have to keep in mind that what the people in ancient times referred to as salt isn't exactly the same thing as what we refer to. There were no refineries, for example, in the ancient world. And what these people referred to as salt was actually a white powder, usually, very often gathered from around the Dead Sea, or the Salt Sea as it's sometimes referred to. And this white powder contained sodium chloride in it, but it was also mixed with some other things as well. In other words, to them, salt wasn't necessarily pure sodium chloride. And it's been suggested that sodium chloride was one of the most soluble components in this mixture, which means it was the easiest to kind of wash out. And so when that happened, the residue that was left behind still looked a lot like salt. And it would have still been called salt by the people of that day. But it neither tasted nor functioned like salt. It was useless, as Jesus said. No longer good for anything except to be thrown out, to be trampled under people's feet. And so implied in the words of Jesus is the fact that we can lose our effectiveness. We can cease to have the kind of impact in this world that the Lord intends for us to have by failing to maintain our distinctiveness. And that sometimes happens, of course, when people are influenced by the world rather than influencing the world. I'm sure you understand that this happens more often than any of us would like to admit. And so rather than influencing the world by being different, by functioning as disciples of Jesus, too many Christians adopt the world's standards, and they become a corrupting influence rather than a preserving influence. And I wish I could say that never happens, but we know it does. Jesus recognized that danger. And he would say in John chapter 17 about his disciples, he would say in his prayer to God, I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. Don't let them be overcome by evil, in other words. He knew that they were needed in this world. And yet he also knew that there were dangers involved in that. And they're everywhere. Other times, our failure to maintain our distinctiveness may not be the result of direct influence by the world, but rather maybe indirect influence. And what I mean by that is that some Christians would never allow the world to determine their behavior. We're not going to live like the world does. But we're also not going to live in such a way that we influence the world either. It's as if they want to be disciples of Jesus, but just secret disciples. I don't want anybody to know about that. And so they want to live right, but they're not really interested in influencing the lives of other people. But I'll tell you what, I don't think we have a choice in that. Not if we look at what the Lord says. And so let me ask you a question. If we're not having an impact on this world that is for good, that is holding back the corruption and holding back the decay, what purpose do we really serve? I think we need to come to terms with the fact that we're here, at least in part, to have an impact on the world in which we live. That's why God put us here. And if we're not doing that, then we're failing to do what the Lord said his people ought to do. And so one thing we have to come to terms with is that we're not here solely to look out for our own interests. It's not, I'll have a little bit of religion, and I'll be a basically good person, and I won't do the thou shalt nots, and I'll engage in a few of the thou shalts, and I'll just be an all-around good guy. But on the whole, I'm kind of just going to do what I want to do and go about life in such a way that I find enjoyment and fulfillment. I saw a book a while back. I didn't read it. I didn't get it, but I like the title. It's called "It's Not About You." And I just tell you what, that's a good point. It's not about us. And I think that's something we need to remember. We're not here to accomplish what we want to accomplish or to do those things that bring us comfort and joy. We are to do those things that honor God, glorify Him, and make an impact for His kingdom. That's why we're here. And one thing God wants us to do is to influence this world to do that in the right way, to help hold back the corruption in a world that is getting ever more rotten. And I'll tell you what, I don't suppose there's ever been a time when the world didn't need that kind of influence. It certainly did when Jesus came into the world. And I can't think of any other time when it didn't. But I tell you what, it's obvious that our world does now. Are we committed as Christians to having the kind of effect that the Lord intends for us to have in the world? Or have we come to the point where we're simply content to live lives that are not ungodly? And I tell you what, world, if you would like to be influenced, we meet at 6 p.m. on Sunday evenings. I don't know about that. It's not going to do it all by itself. Is it our desire to influence the world around us? Or when we go out there, are we just going to kind of blend into the crowd, so to speak? Just leave the corruption unchecked. So we bring things to a close this evening. I want to ask a couple of questions. And I'm just going to tell you, we've pretty much kind of gone around all of the answers to these questions, but I want to be sure that the points are made. And so first, I'm going to ask you this. Do you recognize your value? Do you recognize your value as a Christian? When you think of the fact that you're the salt of the earth, don't think in terms of that, big blue cylinder of Morton's, salt that you have in the pantry at home. That's not the concept. I don't know if you've ever really looked at that or not, but there's a picture of a girl with an umbrella in one hand, and she's got a container of salt in the other, and the way that she's holding it, the salt's just kind of pouring out the back as she walks along. I don't know, but when I look at that picture, I'm not thinking, this is really valuable stuff. I'm thinking, she's just not taking good care of this thing. I mean, it's just pouring out the back. She doesn't care. It's just salt. But when Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth, he was thinking of a substance that was valuable enough to be used as payment instead of money. It was important enough to be used to ratify a covenant or an agreement. It was important enough to be used in the Old Testament sacrifices. It was something valuable that they were giving up. It was the most effective method of holding back decay in the ancient world. That's how valuable you are as a Christian. You are the means by which God does that. In keeping with that, do you embrace your responsibility? Your responsibility as a Christian. You ever notice that it's just easier to be good in the presence of some people than it is when you're in the presence of others? Both of those are true. It's sometimes easier to do wrong when you're in some people's presence. But what we do and what we say, whether we recognize it or not, it's going to have an effect on other people. Are we making it easier for people to be good by our presence? When you look at your life, does it make other people want to do better? I believe Jesus had that kind of thing in mind, at least in part. And I'll tell you this evening that I don't believe we'll be what Jesus intends for us to be as the salt of the earth. We will not be that by accident. It won't be that we just were going about doing what we wanted to do and wham, we influenced the world. In part, we may be the salt of the earth just by living right. But I also can't help but think that the only way we'll truly be the salt of the earth is by determined effort, by what we choose to do, and by aiming at having that kind of impact. Is that your determination as you go about, as you live from day to day? I hope that our study this evening has given you maybe a renewed perspective of what it means to be in Christ and to be a Christian. We're not just here and we have a slice of our life that's called Christianity, and we come together on occasions like this. This is to be the thing that pervades all. It's to be the reason, this one thing I do, as Paul would talk about in Philippians. We pursue Christ. We live as disciples. We do that in part for our own benefit, but it's not just our own benefit. We do it for the impact that it will have. And we need to seek to be that, to do that. We serve an important function in this world. And it is a function that this world desperately needs. I tell you what, if we don't do it, nobody is. It's not just going to happen accidentally. And so I want to appeal to you this evening to accept the challenge, to think about who you are. To not just think about who you are when we come together and when we sing songs and when we do the things that we do here, but to think about who you are when you go back out there on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, all the days. And think about the impact your life is having. And then determine that you're going to have that impact. That it's going to be for good in the world. It's going to put a dent in it, so to speak. That's going to hold back the corruption. And it's going to do it because you choose to live as a disciple of Jesus. If you're here tonight and you owe some duty to him, we can help you with that, whatever that might be. If you have questions, maybe you don't even know, but you have some questions about Jesus and about following him, about what that means for your life, we'd like to help you with that. We'd like to open up a Bible and just look at what it says, because that's where the answers are found. And if we can help you tonight, we want to ask you to come as we stand and as we sing.
To the world.